She didn't need to destroy me. She just needed everyone to believe I was already broken. I want to tell you about the morning I was committed to a psychiatric clinic I had never agreed to enter. It was a Thursday in April. The kind of Sao Paulo April that is still warm, but beginning to show the edges of the dry season coming, the sky a harder blue than the summer months, the air slightly less heavy. I had woken at 6, as I always wake, and had gone to the kitchen to make coffee. And when I came back to the bedroom, Isabella was standing near the window with her phone in her hand. And she said, "Without looking at me, there are some people downstairs who want to talk to you." The people downstairs were 2 men I did not know, dressed in the specific way of medical professionals conducting a professional visit, not white coats, which are for hospitals, but the neat, anonymous civilian clothes of people who do not want to seem threatening, and who have learned that the specific combination of pressed trousers and a calm voice reduces the resistance they encounter. They were accompanied by my father-in-law, Antonio Salavea, who was standing slightly behind the 2 men, in the way of a person who has arranged something and does not want to appear to have arranged it. I said, "What is this?" The taller of the 2 men said he was a psychiatrist named Dr. Faria, that he was there at the request of my family, that they had concerns about my mental state that warranted a brief voluntary admission for assessment. I said, "I have no mental health concerns. I'm not going voluntarily anywhere." Dr. Faria said, "We have a court order authorizing involuntary assessment." He showed me a document. The document was real. It had been obtained, as I would learn later, through a process initiated by Isabella's family 2 weeks earlier, based on a psychiatric evaluation that I had not participated in and had not known was being conducted, produced by a psychiatrist who had never met me. I stood in the living room of my own apartment in Morumbi on a Thursday morning and looked at the document and understood that the situation I was in was not the situation I had believed I was in when I woke up at 6. I went with them, not because I believed the document or the process or the assessment I had never participated in, because refusing would have produced a physical confrontation that would have been used against me, and because I already understood, in the first 5 minutes of that morning, that everything that was happening was being documented for purposes that had nothing to do with my mental health. The clinic was in Alphaville. The admission paperwork was prepared. I was shown to a room that was clean and comfortable in the specific way of private psychiatric facilities in Sao Paulo that serve wealthy patients a television, a private bathroom, a window overlooking a garden. I sat in the room and I thought about what I needed to do and what I needed to understand before I could do it. The first thing I needed to understand was how this had been built. The court order, the psychiatric evaluation. The 2 men in civilian clothes, none of this had been assembled overnight. This was the result of planning, of preparation, of a process that had been running in the background of my marriage for a period of time I did not yet know. The second thing I needed to understand was why, now, Isabella and I had been married for 8 years. We had a 6-year-old daughter named Clara. We had been, for the last 2 years, in a marriage that was not working cold, distant, the specific atmosphere of 2 people who have stopped engaging with each other and who have not yet decided what to do about the fact. But 2 years of a difficult marriage is not an unusual situation. It was not, by itself, the explanation for what had happened on Thursday morning. I thought about the last 6 months, about the changes I had noticed in Isabella's behavior, the increased time she spent with her parents, the specific conversations about the company that had a quality I had not fully named at the time, but that I recognized now as the conversations of a person who is building a case, about the incidents that I had attributed to the ordinary friction of a difficult marriage, and that I now suspected had been constructed for a different purpose. The third thing I needed to understand was what this was for. Psychiatric commitment as a tactic in a marital dispute is not a new thing. It has been used, historically, to discredit opponents, to remove people from situations that their presence makes difficult, to establish a narrative of incompetence that then justifies the actions that follow. The actions that would follow the narrative of mental incapacity in my situation were not hard to identify: the control of assets, the control of the children, the specific form of custody and financial arrangement that results when one party in a divorce is established as mentally incapacitated. Clara. I sat in the room in Alphaville, and I thought about Clara, who was 6 years old, and who was, at this moment, in our apartment in Marumbi with her mother and her grandparents, and who I did not know when I would see again or under what conditions. Then I stopped thinking about the things I could not control, and I started thinking about what I could do from inside a psychiatric clinic in Alphaville with no phone. They had taken my phone at admission, and no lawyer, and no way to contact anyone I trusted. The first thing I could do was nothing that would confirm the narrative. This was the most important constraint, and I held it from the first hour. Whatever they were documenting my behavior, my affect, my responses to the staff, and the assessments would be used in the process that was clearly underway. And the process would be best served for them by any behavior that could be characterized as irrational or unstable. I was going to be neither. I was going to be, for as long as I was in the clinic, the most rational and stable version of myself I was capable of being. This required more discipline than anything I had previously attempted. I should tell you who I am and what the marriage was before the Thursday morning, because the context is the story, and the story without the context is just the event. My name is Rafael Montero. I am 42 years old. I was born in Sao Paulo, the son of a civil engineer who built bridges and overpasses across the interior of Sao Paulo state for 30 years, and who taught me, through the specific pedagogy of a man who builds things for a living, that the relationship between what a structure is supposed to do and what it actually does is the most important question you can ask about anything. My mother was a teacher. They were not wealthy. We were comfortable. As the Brazilian middle class that built itself across the 1980s and 1990s was comfortable, with the specific comfort of people who have worked hard for what they have and who hold it accordingly. I studied business at the FGV and then law at the USP. Not because I wanted to be a lawyer, but because I understood that the combination of business and law was the specific toolkit I needed for what I wanted to do, which was to run companies, not to build companies from scratch entrepreneurship in the founding sense, with all its specific romance and its specific risk, but to take companies at specific inflection points and make them what they needed to become. The turnaround kind of management, the kind that requires you to understand a business deeply enough to know what is wrong with it, and then to have the patience and the discipline to fix what is wrong without fixing what is right. I had been doing this for 15 years. The first decade had been in other people's companies, the COO positions, the restructuring roles, the specific form of operational executive that gets brought in when a situation is difficult and who leaves when the situation is resolved. The last 5 years had been in companies I was building toward, with a partner and investor named Marcio Ferreira, who had capital and network and the specific quality of trust that comes from 10 years of doing business together, without either of you having reason to regret it. I was not from a powerful family. This is the most important thing to understand about the marriage to Isabella Salavea. Because the most important thing about the marriage to Isabella Salavea is the differential in origin. The Salavea family was one of the significant families of Sao Paulo's business establishment. Not the most visible, not the kind whose name appeared in the social columns every week, but the kind whose name appeared where it mattered, in the governance of major institutions, in the boards of the companies that provided the infrastructure of the city's commercial life. Antonio Salavea, Isabella's father, had built the family's current position across 40 years of construction and real estate development. With the specific patience and the specific political intelligence of a man who understood that the relationship between commercial success and political connection in Brazil was not a corruption to be avoided, but a reality to be navigated. Isabella was his eldest daughter, and she had grown up with the specific formation that eldest daughters of significant families in Sao Paulo receive private schools. International education, the social fluency of a person who has been trained to be comfortable in the rooms that matter and to understand, intuitively, the power dynamics that organize those rooms. She was 34 when we married, had studied architecture in Paris, had worked at a design firm in London for 2 years, and had come back to Sao Paulo with the specific profile of a person who had left and returned on her own terms. We met at a professional dinner, one of those Sao Paulo business events where the seating is arranged to create connections, and where the connections, if they develop, have a specific professional character even when they become personal. We were seated next to each other. She was interested in the turnaround work I was doing with Marcio. I was interested in her understanding of the relationship between design and business strategy, which was sharper and more practically grounded than I usually encountered in people with her background. We talked through the dinner and the drinks afterward, and I asked if she wanted to continue the conversation another time. She did. 8 months later, we were married. I want to tell you honestly about the marriage, because the honest account is the one that makes what eventually happened comprehensible, and because honesty about the marriage requires me to acknowledge things that are not only about what Isabella did. The first 3 years were good, not perfect. We were two strong-willed people with different formations and different default modes of operating in the world, but genuinely good, with the specific quality of goodness that comes from two people who are genuinely engaged with each other's minds and who find that engagement sustaining. Isabella was the most intellectually interesting person I had been with, and I think I was the same for her. And the intellectual engagement was the foundation of a real partnership. Clara was born in the 4th year. The birth changed things, as births change things, not dramatically, not in the direction of crisis, but in the direction of reorientation. Isabella's engagement with the architecture career, which had been substantial and which I had admired, became secondary to the relationship with Clara in ways that I think she had not fully anticipated, and that I, not having had children before, had not known how to anticipate for her. The adjustment was real, and it was difficult, and we navigated it with varying degrees of success. In the 5th and 6th years, the marriage began to show the specific strain of two people who have been managing a difficult adjustment for 2 years and who have, in the management of it, developed habits of distance that are easier to maintain than to dismantle. We were not hostile. We were politely separate, engaged in the logistics of a shared life and a child without being engaged in each other. In the 7th year, Antonio Salavea began to take a greater interest in my professional activities. At the time, I had understood this as the natural interest of a father-in-law who was well connected in the Sao Paulo business world and who saw opportunities for involvement that might benefit the family. The conversations with Antonio were professionally interesting. He knew the real estate and construction markets in ways that were relevant to projects I was working on, and the information he shared was genuinely useful. I had not examined the interest as closely as I should have, because the information was useful, and the information was the frame I was putting around the interest. The frame I should have been putting around the interest was Antonio Salavea was assessing my businesses the way he would assess any acquisition target, with the specific patience of a man who has spent 40 years understanding when a situation is advantageous and when it is not yet advantageous, and waiting for the difference. What made my situation advantageous to us was not the businesses themselves, which were not yet at the stage where they represented the kind of asset Antonio was interested in. What made it advantageous was the prospect of a divorce in which I had been established as mentally incapacitated, which would allow the assets to be managed under a different structure, a structure that, in the specific mechanics of Brazilian family law, would give significant control to the guardian of the minor child. The guardian of the minor child would be Isabella, whose interests in the management of those assets would be, at that point, entirely aligned with her father's. I was in the clinic for 11 days. I want to tell you about those 11 days in some detail, because they are the days that required the most, and that I think about most clearly in retrospect, the days that determined whether the situation was salvageable or whether it was not. The first day was the day of understanding. I spent it in the room, thinking through the situation as completely as I could with the information I had. I did not speak more than necessary to the staff. I was calm. I was cooperative. I ate the food they brought, and I slept when I could sleep. And when I could not sleep, I continued thinking. What I understood by the end of the first day was this: the commitment was the opening move, not the end game. It was designed to establish a documented record of mental incapacity that could then be used in the family law proceedings that were, I was now certain, already in preparation. The clinic stay would produce an assessment. The assessment would note the involuntary commitment and the circumstances that had led to it. The circumstances would be described by Dr. Faria and by Isabella, and by whatever witnesses she had prepared. And the description would be the description she needed, rather than the description of what had actually happened. The assessment was the key. The assessment was what the clinic stay was for. The second day brought a visitor. It was not Isabella. I had not expected Isabella. It was my business partner Marzio Ferreira, who had been called by my secretary, who had been called by the clinic because the admission paperwork listed the company as an emergency contact, and the clinic was following procedure. Marzio came in the morning, and he sat across from me in the common room, and he looked at me with the expression of a person who is assessing the situation without having enough information to assess it. He said, "Tell me what happened." I told him, not the full account. The full account would take hours and we had 30 minutes. The essential account, the Thursday morning. The 2 men. The court order. The psychiatric evaluation I had never participated in. The document I had not been shown before being brought to the clinic. The fact that this was not a mental health situation but a legal strategy. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need a lawyer, not a family lawyer, a criminal lawyer. Someone who understands how psychiatric commitments are used in family law disputes and who can challenge the court order. I need that person today, and I need you to make sure Clara is with someone I trust, not with Isabella's family, with someone from my side." He said, "I'll have a lawyer here this afternoon. Clara, I'll talk to your mother." I said, "Don't put my mother in a position where she's in direct conflict with Isabella's family. They have more resources than she does, and it will not go well for her. I need someone who can be strategic about the access." He said, "I understand. I'll figure it out." He left. I went back to the room and continued being calm and cooperative and thinking about what came next. The lawyer arrived that afternoon. Her name was Dr. Helena Campos, and she was 51 years old, and she had spent 15 years doing exactly the kind of case I was describing, cases in which psychiatric commitment was used as a tool in family law disputes. Cases that sat at the intersection of civil and criminal law, and that required the specific expertise of a person who understood both domains. She was not warm in the social sense. She was the specific kind of precise that is more useful than warmth in a difficult situation. She read the court order. She read the admission paperwork. She asked me questions for 2 hours. About the marriage, about the last 6 months, about the specific incidents that I had reconstructed across the first day as the likely evidence base for the psychiatric evaluation I had never participated in. When she was done, she said, "The court order is challengeable. The evaluation process was procedurally deficient. The standard for involuntary commitment in Sao Paulo requires either a documented history of mental health treatment or a current behavioral assessment by a treating clinician. And the evaluation that produced this order was done without ever meeting you. We can get you out, but we need to move carefully." I said, "How long?" She said, "If we move too fast, we look like we're trying to suppress assessment rather than challenge an illegitimate process. I want to file within 2 days, but with a challenge framed around the procedural deficiency, not around the substantive claim that you're mentally healthy. The substantive claim they can contest. The procedural deficiency is documentable." I said, 2 days. She said, "In those 2 days, I need you to cooperate with the clinic's assessment. Do whatever they ask. Speak calmly and clearly. Show no anger. Show no urgency. Be exactly the person they can find nothing wrong with." I said, "I've been doing that since yesterday morning." She said, "Good. Keep doing it." She filed on the 3rd day. The challenge was on the procedural deficiency. As she had described, the specific requirements of the Sao Paulo state guidelines for involuntary psychiatric commitment had not been met. And the evaluation that had produced the court order had been conducted without the direct clinical assessment that those guidelines required. The judge who heard the challenge was, according to Helena, not a judge she would have chosen for this kind of case. He was known for conservatism in family matters, for a tendency to defer to institutional assessments rather than to challenge them. She had expected a fight. What she got was a decision, on the 6th day, that the court order was procedurally deficient and that my continued detention was without proper legal basis, and that I was to be released within 24 hours, pending a properly conducted assessment. The properly conducted assessment happened on the morning of the 7th day. A court-appointed psychiatrist named Dr. Araujo, who had no connection to either side and who had been selected by the court, spent 3 hours with me. He was thorough, and he was careful, and he was. I thought from the quality of his questions, experienced in exactly this kind of situation, in cases where psychiatric assessment was being used as a tool, and where the question of who was actually impaired and who was performing impairment on behalf of one party in a dispute required careful discernment. At the end of 3 hours, he said, "I am going to give you my honest assessment, because I think you deserve it." I said, "Please." He said, "I said you are not mentally ill. You are a person who has been in a significantly stressful situation for an extended period, and who has managed that situation with a quality of controlled functioning that is, in my experience, inconsistent with any significant mental health diagnosis. The behaviors described in the evaluation that produced the original court order are not behaviors I have observed, and the manner in which you have described the events of the last 6 days suggests someone who is thinking clearly rather than someone whose thinking is impaired." He said, "I will note in my report that the original evaluation appears to have been conducted without direct clinical contact, and that my findings are significantly inconsistent with its conclusions." I said, "Thank you." He said, "What happens next is not in my domain, but I want you to understand that the report I produce will say what the assessment shows, which is that there is no psychiatric basis for continued detention or for the appointment of a guardian on mental health grounds." I was released on the 8th day, pending the formal filing of Dr. Araujo's report. I walked out of the clinic in Alphaville on a Tuesday afternoon, and Marzio was waiting in the car park, and we drove back to Sao Paulo without saying much for a while, because the first thing I needed was the specific silence of being in a car, moving through a city I knew, seeing the familiar shapes of the expressways and the buildings, and the specific quality of Sao Paulo in the afternoon sun, which is a quality I have never been able to describe to people who haven't experienced it. The combination of the heat and the altitude and the density of the city that produces a specific atmospheric quality that is, to me, home. Marcio said, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "My office, and I need to see Clara today." He said, "Helena is working on it. She filed an emergency access order this morning." I said, "When?" He said, "Today. She thinks. Isabella's lawyers are contesting, but Helena says the contest is thin." Clara. I had not seen Clara in 8 days. She was 6 years old, and her father had disappeared from her daily life for 8 days without explanation. And whatever explanation she had been given was the explanation Isabella had given, and I did not know what that explanation was. I said, "What has Isabella told Clara?" He said, "We don't know yet. Helena is trying to find out." I looked out the window. The marginal Pinheiros was full of the afternoon traffic that it is always full of. The river below the expressway was the river it always is, brown and busy, and utterly uninterested in the human drama being conducted on its banks. I said, "All right, tell me what we need to do." The months that followed were the months I want to tell you about most carefully, because they are the months in which everything that mattered was built or destroyed. And because the building is the part of the story that I am most proud of and most grateful for having been capable of. Helena Campos was the right lawyer. I want to say this before I describe what she did, because saying it first is the accurate characterization, and the accurate characterization is what the account requires. She was the right lawyer, not because she was the most aggressive or the most clever or the most well-connected, though she was, in her specific domain. All three. She was the right lawyer because she understood immediately and completely what the situation was and what it required, and because she did not waste a single day on approaches that would not serve the purpose. The purpose was Clara, the accurate record, and the businesses. In that order, Clara was the primary objective. The accurate record, the documentation of what had been done, and what the actual situation was the precondition for everything else. The businesses were the secondary objective, important but recoverable in ways that Clara's custody was not, if we got the custody wrong. Helena's first move, after Monterrey's, was the emergency access order. She filed it on the Tuesday morning, before I was released, and she obtained a temporary order by Tuesday afternoon that required Isabella to allow me access to Clara for a minimum of 2 hours on Tuesday evening. Supervised by a court-appointed social worker, I saw Clara on Tuesday at 6 o'clock, in a neutral space, a children's facility near Villa Olympia that the court used for supervised access visits. She was brought in by a woman I did not recognize, one of Isabella's household staff. She came into the room, and she looked at me for a moment with the specific expression of a 6-year-old who has been told something that she is trying to reconcile with what she knows from her own experience. She said, "Papai, are you sick?" I sat down on the floor so I was at her level. I said, "No. Meu amor, I am not sick. I had to be away for a while because of some grown-up problems. But the grown-up problems are being solved, and I am not sick." She looked at me. She said, "Vovo said you were sick, and that's why you couldn't call." I said Vovo was wrong. I was not allowed to call. That's different from being sick. She considered this with the specific seriousness of a 6-year-old working through a piece of information that conflicts with something she has been told. She said, "You're here now." I said, "I'm here now." She climbed into my lap, and we sat on the floor of the supervised access facility for 2 hours, and I read to her from a book I had brought, and we talked about her week at school. And she told me about a drawing she had made, and about a fight she had had with a friend, and about the birthday party she was going to on Saturday. And I held her with the specific quality of holding a child that is not dramatic and not intense, and that is simply the holding of a person you love while you still can. When the 2 hours were over, she left with the household staff member. She waved at the door. I sat in the room after she left for a while. Then I called Helena and said what's next. What was next? Across the following 4 months was one of the most complex legal situations I have been involved in. And I have been involved in some complex legal situations across 15 years of business. Helena's strategy was built on 4 elements. The first was the court-appointed psychiatrist's report, which was filed the week after my release, and which was, in its language and its conclusions, as clear and as useful as Dr. Araujo had suggested it would be. The report documented the procedural deficiencies of the original evaluation, noted the absence of direct clinical contact in that evaluation, described the 3-hour assessment that had been conducted, and concluded with a finding of no psychiatric disorder and no basis for ongoing mental health intervention of any kind. The report was a formal document of the Sao Paulo Family Court, and it was part of the permanent record of the proceedings. The second element was the investigation into how the original evaluation had been produced. Helena had engaged a private investigator to trace the chain of events who had initiated the request for the evaluation, who had produced it, what the relationship was between Dr. Faria and the Salavea family. The investigation took 6 weeks and produced a picture that was, in Helena's assessment, highly significant. Dr. Faria was a psychiatrist whose practice was in Jardines. He had no previous relationship with me or with any member of my family. He did have a relationship with Antonio Salaveja specifically. He had provided psychiatric assessments in at least 2 previous family law cases involving parties connected to the Salaveja family's business network, in both of which the assessment had concluded in favor of the Salaveja-connected party. The relationship was not documented as financial. The payments, if there were payments, were routed in ways that were not immediately visible. But the pattern was consistent, and the pattern was documentable. The documentation of the pattern was the basis for the criminal complaint that Helena filed in the 5th week. The complaint was against Dr. Faria, primarily, and against the unnamed person who had commissioned the evaluation unnamed, because the evidence for Antonio's direct involvement was inferential rather than documentary. The complaint alleged the production of a false medical document and its use in a judicial proceeding, which under Brazilian criminal law is a serious offense, carrying significant potential consequences. Helena had not told me she was going to file the criminal complaint. She had told me she was building toward it, but the timing she had not specified when she called to tell me she had filed. I said, "Is the complaint solid?" She said, "It is documentable. Whether it produces a prosecution depends on factors I can't control. But the filing changes the situation in ways that go beyond whether it produces a prosecution." I said, "How?" She said, "Dr. Faria now has personal criminal exposure. Antonio Salavea has now had the mechanism he used brought into a formal legal context where it is documented and where its character is named. The naming changes the cost-benefit calculation for continuing the approach." I said, "You're using the complaint as leverage." She said, "I'm using it as the accurate characterization of what was done, which happens to have strategic utility." The third element was the asset protection. The businesses needed to be secured against any attempt by Isabella or her family to access or challenge them during the proceedings, and Helena had engaged a commercial lawyer to work alongside her on this element. The commercial lawyer's name was Dr. Renato Braz, and he was expert in exactly the kind of corporate structuring that protects operating businesses from family law proceedings, not through anything that could be characterized as hiding assets, but through the specific legitimate mechanisms of Brazilian corporate law that distinguish between personal and business assets in ways that are relevant to family law settlements. The businesses were Marcio's and mine, in the specific form of a partnership structure that had been designed. at Marzio's insistence, early in our partnership, with exactly the kind of clear separation of personal and partnership interests that now served us well. Renato reviewed the structure and confirmed that the existing documentation clearly established the nature of the partnership assets as distinct from my personal assets in ways that would withstand the scrutiny of a family court. The fourth element was Clara. Clara was the most important element, and the one that Helena worked on with the most care and the most patience, because the custody determination was the determination that would matter most, and that was the most difficult to influence through conventional legal argument. Courts in Sao Paulo family proceedings had, in Helena's experience, a tendency to default to maternal custody in situations where the father's mental state had been questioned, regardless of the subsequent finding that no mental health issue existed. The default was not the law. The law required an assessment of the best interests of the child, but it was the cultural gravity that the proceedings operated within. Countering the cultural gravity required evidence of specific harm to Clara's interests from the maternal custody arrangement, or specific benefit from the paternal arrangement that was not available from the maternal one. Helena had begun building both lines of evidence in the first week. The evidence of specific benefit from my involvement with Clara was the easier line. I had been, by all accounts, available from Clara's school, from the parents of her classmates, from the pediatrician who had been seeing her since birth, an actively engaged and consistently present father. This was documentable. The school had attendance records for parent events. The pediatrician had appointment records that showed my presence at a significant proportion of Clara's medical visits. The families of Clara's friends had direct experience of my engagement with Clara's life. The evidence of specific harm from the maternal arrangement was the harder and more important line. It required Helena to establish that the situation Isabella had created, the 8-day absence of Clara's father, without explanation, the narrative of mental illness that Clara had been given, the disruption to Clara's relationship with her father, had caused demonstrable harm to a 6-year-old child, and that the continuation of the arrangement that had produced this harm was not in Clara's best interests. This required a child psychologist. Helena had engaged one doctor, Mariana Silveira, who had been assessing children in family law proceedings for 20 years, and who had the specific credentials and the specific experience that courts in Sao Paulo family proceedings gave weight to. Doctor. Mariana began meeting with Clara in the 3rd week after my release. The meetings were not interrogations. They were the specific form of play-based assessment that a child psychologist uses with a 6-year-old. Sessions in a room with art materials and toys, and the specific indirect approach that allows a child to communicate what she knows and feels without the adult framing that direct questioning would impose. I was not present at the sessions. I was not told the content of them that was between Dr. Mariana and the court. What I was told, by Helena, who was told by Dr. Mariana in the formal way of a professional communication, was that the sessions were producing material that was relevant to the assessment of Clara's situation, and that would be useful in the proceedings. I continued to have access to Clara under the supervised arrangement. 2 evenings per week. The 2 evenings were the anchors of each week, the fixed points around which everything else was organized. The 2 occasions when the rest of the situation receded to the background, and what was in the foreground was simply being with my daughter. She was adjusting. Not perfectly 6-year-olds do not adjust to the disruption of their family structure perfectly. And Clara was not adjusting perfectly. But she was adjusting with the specific resilience of a child who has a secure relationship with both parents and who is able to hold the disruption without it destroying the security. The 2 evenings were the evidence of the security and the evidence that the security was intact. Isabella and I spoke 3 times during the 4 months of the proceedings, not in the emotional way of 2 people in a disintegrating marriage, trying to communicate in the specific formal way of 2 parties in a legal proceeding who have been advised by their respective lawyers to minimize direct communication, and who are following that advice except in the specific situations where direct communication is necessary. The first time was on the telephone, 3 weeks after my release. She called without warning, on a Tuesday morning, and I answered because I was curious what she would say, and because Helena had said, if she calls directly, listen, but commit to nothing, and tell me immediately afterward. She said, I want to talk to you about Clara. I said my lawyer is the right person to talk to about Clara. She said, I'm not talking to you as lawyers. I'm talking to you as Clara's mother. I said, what do you want to say? She said, I want her to not be damaged by this. I said, then you should not have started this. She said, Raphael. I said, I'm going to end this call. If you want to discuss Clara, have your lawyer call Helena. I ended the call. I called Helena immediately. Helena said, good. That's exactly the right response. The second conversation was in the family court mediator's office. In the 7th week, the court had mandated a mediation session as part of the proceedings. This is standard in Sao Paulo family law cases with children, and both Isabella and I attended, with our respective lawyers. The mediation lasted 3 hours. The mediator was a woman named Dr. Conceição, who had the specific patient intelligence of someone who has been in rooms between people who hate each other for 20 years and who has learned to hear what is being said between the stated positions. Nothing was resolved at the mediation. This was what Helena had predicted. The positions were too far apart, and the trust was entirely gone. And mediation in that context produces at most a clear map of the positions rather than any movement toward resolution. What the mediation produced, from my perspective, was 2 things. I saw Isabella's face for the first time in 7 weeks, and I saw her father, who was present as what the mediation document described as family support, and who sat at the table with the specific quality of authority of a man who has organized a situation and who is present to ensure it proceeds according to plan. Antonio Salavea looked across the table in the mediator's office like a man who expected to win. The expression was not arrogant. He was too experienced for arrogance in a legal context. It was the quieter expression of a person who has built something carefully and who believes it is solid. I looked back at him for a long moment, and I thought about what Helena had been building for 7 weeks, and about what Dr. Araujo's report said, and about the criminal complaint against Dr. Faria, and about what the months ahead were going to look like. I did not smile. I simply held his gaze until the mediator redirected the room. And then I looked away. The third conversation was at the door of the supervised access facility, where Isabella had come to collect Clara after one of the evening sessions. This had not happened before. Usually the household staff collected Clara, and I did not know she was going to be there until I walked Clara to the door and saw her standing in the lobby. Clara saw her mother and ran to her. Isabella held Clara and looked at me over Clara's shoulder. She said, "Quietly, how long are you going to do this?" I said, "As long as it takes." She said, "You know that, no matter how this ends, it's not going to be the way you want it to end." I said, "You don't know what I want." She said, "You want to win." I said, "I want Clara to grow up with her father in her life. If that's winning, then yes." She looked at me for a moment. She had the expression of a person who is committed to a course of action, and who is, in a brief and unguarded moment, questioning whether the commitment was right. The moment lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the expression was gone, and she took Clara's hand, and they left. I stood in the lobby of the supervised access facility, and I thought about 8 years of marriage, and what they had contained, and what they had produced, and what any of it had actually been. And I found that I did not have a clean answer to any of those questions, and that the not having was, by that point, something I was beginning to make peace with. The marriage had been real. The ending of it was real. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other. The custody determination came 4 months after my release from the clinic. 4 months of Helena's methodical work, of Dr. Mariana's sessions with Clara, of the criminal complaint that had produced the specific outcome Helena had anticipated, not a prosecution. Not yet. But the withdrawal of Dr. Faria from the proceedings and the specific public acknowledgement, documented in his withdrawal letter, that the original evaluation had been produced under circumstances that he now considered to have been inappropriate. The withdrawal letter was not an admission, but it was a document, and the document said what it said. And what it said was sufficient for the court's purposes. The custody determination was made by a judge named Dr. Jose Alves de Cruz, who had been assigned to the case 4 weeks before the determination, and who had the specific reputation, in Helena's assessment, of being thorough and of giving weight to the evidence rather than to the default. He had read all of it: Dr. Araujo's report, Dr. Mariana's assessment, the school and pediatrician records, the documentation of Dr. Faria's withdrawal, and the full record of the proceedings. He found, on the basis of that record, that the circumstances of my involuntary commitment had been the product of a process that was not supported by genuine clinical evidence of mental health impairment, and that the subsequent assessment had found no such impairment. He found that I was a fit and engaged parent, whose relationship with Clara was demonstrated by the evidence to be beneficial to her development. He found that the disruption to Clara's relationship with me, that the circumstances of the previous 4 months had produced, was not in her best interests. He ordered shared custody, with a physical arrangement that gave me Clara, for half the time not the sole custody I had hoped for, and not the supervised access I had been living with for 4 months, but shared custody, legal shared custody, with my name attached to her decisions and my time with her protected by the court's order. The financial settlement took another 2 months to finalize. The businesses were structured as Helena and Renato had maintained they should be as partnership assets, distinct from personal marital assets, not subject to division in the family law proceedings. My personal assets were subject to division and were divided. In a settlement that Helena negotiated with the specific patient precision of someone who understands that the settlement you accept today is the one you live with for years, the settlement was not favorable to me in financial terms. Isabella's family had resources and legal representation that I could not match, and the financial settlement reflected that differential. What the settlement preserved was the operating businesses and my relationship with Clara, and those were the two things that mattered. Antonio Salavia had not gotten what he wanted. Not completely. He had gotten a financial settlement for his daughter that was better than what a straightforward divorce would have produced. He had not gotten the psychiatric finding that would have given him the asset management structure he had been building toward. He had not gotten the custody arrangement that would have marginalized my role in Clara's life. I do not know whether he considered the outcome a partial victory or a failure. I do not need to know. Clara is 8 years old now, and she is. By any measure I can apply, that is not compromised by parental love, which is a real compromise. I acknowledge it doing well. She is clever and sociable, and she draws constantly, filling notebooks with the specific, intricate drawings of a child who is working out the world on paper. She has her mother's precision and my willingness to argue, which is a combination that will serve her well in some contexts and will be difficult in others. She asks questions that are, for an 8-year-old, unusually precise. She wants to know why things are the way they are, not just what they are. And when she is given a partial answer, she notices that it is partial. The shared custody arrangement works in the specific, imperfect way of shared custody arrangements when the parents are not communicating well. Isabella and I do not communicate easily. The trust that the proceedings destroyed is not recoverable in any form that resembles what it was. And we have both accepted that and built the arrangement around the acceptance rather than around a fiction of cooperation. The communication that is necessary for Clara's sake happens. The communication that would be required for anything beyond Clara's sake does not. Clara moves between the two households with the specific adaptability of a child who has grown up in this arrangement and who has learned, as children do, to navigate the different registers of the two environments. My apartment, which is smaller and quieter and organized around the working life I am continuing to build, and her mother's house, which is larger and more managed and organized around the Salavea family's way of being in the world. She is, I think, learning from both the precision and the patience that the Salavea environment produces in the people it shapes, and the directness and the willingness to see things clearly, even when the seeing is uncomfortable, that I hope I am providing. The combination is not guaranteed to produce anything in particular, but it is the combination that is available, and I am making it the best combination I can. I see her every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and every other weekend. The Tuesday and Thursday evenings are the anchors, the fixed points. The two occasions when I am simply her father and nothing else is required of me. We eat dinner, and she tells me about school, and we draw together sometimes, and we watch films, and she falls asleep on the sofa occasionally, and I carry her to bed. These are the evenings I look forward to most, and they are the evenings that tell me most clearly what the 4 months were for. The 4 months were for this, the ability to be present in her life, twice a week, as simply her father. The ability to be present, that was the whole of it. Marcio and I have continued the businesses, the restructuring work, the specific form of operational management that I have been doing for 15 years. Continues. The businesses have grown in the 2 years since the proceedings concluded, not dramatically, not in the way of businesses that are making headlines, but in the specific, patient way of businesses that are built correctly and that benefit from the sustained attention of people who understand what they are doing. Antonio Salavia attempted, in the year after the proceedings concluded, to enter into a competing arrangement in one of the markets we were working in. The attempt was through a third party, managed at a distance, in the specific way of a man who does not want to be seen to be directly competing with his daughter's ex-husband, but who does want to compete. The competition produced nothing useful for him. The relationships I had built in that market across 3 years were mine, in the specific and irreplaceable way of business relationships that are built through sustained and reliable performance rather than through capital or connection. He has not tried again. As far as I know, I think about the clinic in Alphaville sometimes. Not often. It is not the kind of memory I return to voluntarily, but sometimes. Specifically, when I'm in a situation that requires the specific quality of calm and controlled functioning that the 11 days in the clinic required of me in their most demanding form. I think about the first morning in that room and about the decision I made in the first hour. The decision was to be exactly the person they can find nothing wrong with, not perform being that person. Be that person. There is a difference, and the difference matters. And the difference is that performing it produces a quality of controlled behavior that skilled observers can identify as performance, while being it produces the actual thing, which is not identifiable as anything other than what it is. I had spent 40 years being, more or less consistently, the person I believed myself to be. The clinic was the test of whether that consistency was real or whether it was conditional, whether it held only in conditions that were reasonable and friendly, or whether it held in conditions that were designed to produce its collapse. It held. Dr. Araujo had found nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong to find. This is not a triumphant statement. It is simply the accurate one. The accurate statement is the only one I know how to make about any of this. And accuracy is what the account requires. And the account is what you now have. Clara is 8 years old. She is drawing in the next room. In 20 minutes she will come and show me the drawing and ask what I think. And I will tell her what I think, which will be the truth of what I think rather than the version that simply encourages her. Because she is old enough to know the difference, and I want her to know that I am the person who will always tell her the truth. I am her father. I am going to be her father for as long as I am alive. That was what the 4 months were for. That is what everything was for. I want to tell you more about the 8 years before the Thursday morning, because those years are the soil of the story, and a person who doesn't understand the marriage doesn't understand why the Thursday morning was possible, or why it produced what it produced. The first year of the marriage was the year of discovery, of learning who the other person actually was, under the careful presentation of courtship. Isabella was more demanding than she had appeared, in the specific way of people who have been raised in an environment where their preferences are the primary organizing principle of shared life. This was not a character flaw. It was the result of her formation, and her formation had produced, alongside the specific quality of expectation, a genuine intelligence and a genuine capability that more than compensated for the difficulty of her expectations. I had my own ways of being difficult, which her intelligence identified and which she managed with a precision I found both challenging and admirable. The second and third years were the years of building a shared life in the specific form that two working people in Sao Paulo build a shared life, the apartment. The routines, the social world that is partly his and partly hers and partly theirs. The specific negotiations of space and time and priority that a partnership requires, and that reveal, in the process of negotiation, what each person's actual values are as distinct from their stated values. What I discovered in those years was that Isabella's relationship to the Salavea family was closer than I had understood from the outside. Not in the sense of dependence. She was not dependent in any obvious way. She had her own income and her own professional identity and her own life that was genuinely hers. But in the sense of orientation, the Salavea family was her primary reference point for what good decisions looked like, for what success looked like, for what the life she was building was supposed to be. Her father's opinion mattered to her in a way that was not the ordinary weight of parental regard, but the more specific weight of a person who has been shaped to see her parents as the primary authority on what is worth doing and what is not. I had found this in the early years. Charming in a way, the family warmth, the Sunday lunches in Hagenopolis, the specific quality of the Salavea household that was organized around the pleasure of people who know how to live well. Antonio had been warm and interested, and the family dinners had been genuinely enjoyable occasions. What I had not fully examined was the consistency of Antonio's interest in my professional activities. The questions were always intelligent, and the interest was always genuine. He was not performing interest. He actually wanted to understand what I was doing. But the questions, looking back, had a direction. They were building toward an understanding of the businesses that went beyond the ordinary curiosity of a father-in-law about his son-in-law's work. In the fourth year, when Isabella became pregnant and Clara was born, the dynamic in the family shifted in a way that I noticed, but did not name at the time. Antonio's position within our household, not physically. He was not intrusive in any visible way, but in the decision-making about Clara, about the apartment, about the way the family's life was organized, became more significant. His opinions were solicited by Isabella in ways that sometimes bypassed the conversation between us. His preferences were reflected in decisions that I had thought were ours to make together. This was a tension, not a crisis. We had the conversation about it more than once, and Isabella understood my concern and agreed to manage the boundary more carefully. But the tension persisted, and it persisted in the specific way of a thing that is acknowledged and managed at the surface without being resolved at the root. The fifth year was the year I became aware that Isabella was unhappy in ways that went beyond the ordinary unhappiness of a marriage that had become habitual. She was restless. She was spending more time with her family and less time in the specific shared spaces of our life together. She was working again. She had returned to the architecture work, part-time, after a maternity leave that she had extended significantly. And the return to work had coincided with a quality of re-engagement with her own life that was good for her, but that was happening in ways that were not happening with me. I understood this at the time as the natural re-emergence of a person from the specific absorption of early motherhood. I was right about the natural re-emergence, but I was missing the direction of it. The re-emergence was not toward the marriage, it was toward the life she would have without the marriage, and the planning for that life had begun in ways I was not yet aware of. In the 6th year, Isabella asked for a family meeting. The family meeting included Antonio and Mariana, her parents, and my mother. And it was the kind of meeting that only happens in Brazilian families, of a certain formation, the formal and explicit engagement of the extended family in the couple's affairs. The stated purpose was to discuss the family's long-term plans, which Isabella characterized as a conversation about the direction of our lives together. The actual conversation, which I understood better in retrospect than in the moment, was a conversation in which Antonio's vision of what the family's future should look like, a vision in which Isabella and Clara and my businesses were more closely integrated into the Salavea family's operations, was presented as the natural next step in the marriage's development. I had pushed back, not aggressively, but clearly the businesses were a partnership with Marcio and were not available for integration into any other structure. My professional autonomy was not a negotiating point. The marriage was not a mechanism for the expansion of the Salavea family's commercial interests. The pushback was received with the specific composed patience of a man who has been refused something he expected, and who is revising his timeline but not his objective. The 7th and 8th years were the years of the slow unraveling of Isabella, and me becoming the politely separate people I described earlier. Of the Sunday lunches in Higienopolis becoming more frequent for Isabella and less frequent for me. Of the specific climate of a marriage where both people are managing their disengagement rather than addressing it. And then the Thursday morning, I want to tell you about Marcio Ferreira. Because Marcio is the element of the story that most clearly demonstrates what the story is not about. It is not about heroism or dramatic loyalty, but about the specific and practical quality of a business partner who responds to a crisis with exactly the right kind of efficiency. Marcio is 49 years old, and he has been in Sao Paulo's business world for 25 years, with the specific patient intelligence of a man who understands that the relationship between capital and execution is the most important relationship in business, and who has spent 25 years finding the right executions for his capital. He is not a warm person in the social sense. He is reliable in the specific and valuable sense. When he says he will do something, it is done. And when he says something cannot be done, he has assessed the situation accurately enough that the cannot is accurate. He came to the clinic the second day, not because he was performing loyalty, but because his business partner had disappeared from view and the situation required assessment. He assessed it the way he assesses all situations, by getting the information and then taking the appropriate action. The appropriate action, in this case, was Helena Campos and my mother, and the careful management of the subsequent 4 months in a way that protected the businesses while I was managing the personal and legal situation. Marcio's management of the businesses during those 4 months was, in its quality of sustained and calm attention, exactly what was required. He dealt with the client relationships, kept the operational work running, managed the situations that required management without making decisions that were mine to make. When the proceedings concluded, and I was back in full operation. He said, ready to go back to work. I said yes. He said, we have 3 situations that need your attention. We went through the 3 situations. He had the files. The files were complete. The work had continued. This is the thing about a genuine partnership. It doesn't require the drama of loyalty. It requires the daily and practical quality of a person who shows up and does what needs to be done, in the specific form in which it needs to be done, without requiring the crisis to validate the partnership or the loyalty to be performed for an audience. Marcio showed up. He did what needed to be done. The business continued. That is the whole of the Marcio story, and the whole of it is significant. I want to tell you about Sao Paulo and what the city has to do with the story, because Sao Paulo is not simply a setting. It is the specific medium in which a situation like this one is possible, and in which it takes the form it took. Sao Paulo is the largest city in South America and one of the largest in the world, and its size produces a specific quality of anonymity alongside the specific quality of connection that characterizes large, wealthy cities everywhere. The families who run Sao Paulo's business and political and social world are a relatively small group, and the small group operates with the specific density of connection that small groups operating in a large environment always produce. Everyone who matters knows everyone else who matters. The information flows through the network with a speed that the city's physical size might suggest was impossible. And the ability to make things happen depends not only on resources, but on where you are in the network and who you can reach. The Salavia family was embedded in this network in a way that I was not. Antonio had spent 40 years building the connections and the reputation that allowed him to make things happen in Sao Paulo. And the things he could make happen included the specific thing he had attempted to make happen on the Thursday morning. A psychiatric court order obtained through a physician who had a track record of producing the assessment the requesting family needed. This is not something that is possible in every city. It is possible in Sao Paulo. In the specific intersection of private medicine and family law and political connection that Sao Paulo's establishment produces. What is also possible in Sao Paulo, and what Helena understood, is the counter-movement. The same network that allowed Antonio to make things happen also transmitted the information that Helena needed to establish the pattern of Dr. Faria's previous assessments, to understand the shape of what had been done, to build the criminal complaint with the specific evidentiary foundation that made it credible rather than merely accusatory. Helena had been working in this network for 15 years. She knew which investigator to use, which court officers to approach, which judges had reputations for thoroughness. She knew the specific channels through which the counter-movement could be built. This is not corruption. It is the specific knowledge of how a city operates that comes from 15 years of working in it. Every city operates through networks, through the relationships and the reputations and the information flows that constitute its actual functioning, as distinct from its formal functioning. The person who understands those networks and who works within them correctly has advantages that the person who doesn't understand them does not have. Antonio had understood the networks and had worked within them incorrectly. He had used them for a purpose that was not legitimate, and the incorrectness was discoverable because it had produced a documentable pattern. Helena had understood the networks and had worked within them correctly. and the correctness was discoverable because it produced results that were defensible on their merits. São Paulo is a city where both of these things are possible, and where the difference between them is not always visible from outside, but is always visible from inside, to the people who have the specific knowledge to see it. I had not had that knowledge when I married into the Salavea family. I had it by the time the proceedings concluded. The months after the settlement had a specific quality. The quality of a period of reconstruction after a structure has been damaged. Not destroyed, because the structure had not been destroyed. Damaged in the specific way that things are damaged when they have been tested at the limits of their resilience and have held, but have not held, perfectly. The businesses needed rebuilding of the client relationships that the 4 months of proceedings had disrupted, not destroyed, but disrupted, in the specific way of relationships that are based on trust and that are affected when the person at the center of them is absent for 4 months, dealing with a personal crisis. I spent the first 6 months of the post-settlement period in sustained relationship management visits. Calls, the demonstration of continued commitment and capability that reestablishes trust that has been shaken. The relationships held. Not all of them. 2 situations that had been promising before the proceedings had moved in different directions during the 4 months, and the moving was not fully reversible. But most of them held, and the holding was the confirmation of what I had believed about the businesses, that the relationships were built on genuine performance and genuine reliability, and that genuine performance and genuine reliability are more durable than situations that are built on position or connection. I was not the person with the position or the connection. I was the person who performed and delivered reliably. Those things are recoverable from a 4-month absence in a way that position and connection are not recoverable from the kind of exposure that Antonio had experienced through the criminal complaint and the court proceedings. I am not going to tell you that Antonio was significantly damaged by the exposure. He was a man of 63 with 40 years of accumulated position and connection in São Paulo, and the exposure of a single failed strategy, however serious, was not going to undo 40 years. The Salavea family continued. Antonio continued. The name was still on the buildings and in the boardrooms, and at the Sunday lunches in Higienópolis. What changed was the cost-benefit calculation. The specific approach that had been attempted, the psychiatric commitment. The asset management structure. The full asset and custody capture had been exposed, documented, and addressed through both civil and criminal channels. The exposure meant that attempting a similar approach again, in any future context where Isabella's family's interests and mine intersected, would be significantly more costly than it had been the first time. The calculation had changed. I was aware of this. I was also aware that the changed calculation was the most I could expect, and I had made my peace with it being the most. The people who had done what had been done were still in the world and still in positions from which they could act. The countermeasures I had taken had not imprisoned them or destroyed their position, or produced the kind of dramatic consequence that the scale of what had been attempted might seem to warrant. What the countermeasures had produced was the accurate record. Clara's custody on terms that gave me genuine presence in her life, and the protection of the businesses. These were the outcomes that mattered, and they were the outcomes I had worked for. The accurate record, in the specific São Paulo context, had its own consequences beyond the formal ones. The information about Dr. Faria's pattern of assessments and about the circumstances of the Thursday morning was now known in the relevant professional and social networks. The family court judges who would process any future proceedings involving the Salavea family in this domain had the record available to them. The psychiatrists who operated in the private family law assessment space in Sao Paulo knew that a pattern of this kind had been identified and documented and had produced a criminal complaint. These are the specific consequences that the accurate record produces in a city where the network is the medium of consequence. Not dramatic, not visible from outside the network, but real and lasting and, in the specific situation I was in, sufficient. There is something I want to tell you about the 11 days in the clinic that I haven't told you yet. Because I have described the strategy and the lawyer and the assessment, but I haven't described the specific interior experience of those 11 days. And the interior experience is the part of the account that is hardest to describe and most important to describe accurately. The first 24 hours were the hardest. Not the hardest in the sense of fear. I was not primarily afraid, or not in the way I might have expected fear to manifest. I was something that is harder to name the specific state of a person who has understood that their fundamental assumptions about the situation they were in were wrong, and who is now rebuilding those assumptions from scratch, while simultaneously functioning in an environment that is hostile and that is monitoring the functioning. The assumption that was most wrong was the assumption about Isabella. I had known, for 2 years, that the marriage was in difficulty. I had not known, had not allowed myself to know, which is a different failure, that the difficulty had taken the form of an active plan rather than the passive deterioration of a relationship that both people had stopped working on. There is a specific shock in discovering that the person you are closest to has been not merely absent from the work of the relationship, but actively working against your interests in ways you did not observe. The shock of it arrived in the first morning in the clinic, when I had enough information to understand the basic structure of what had happened. And it arrived the way shocks arrive to people who are trying not to be shocked, not as an overwhelming wave, but as a sustained and cold understanding that the territory is different from the map. I sat with it. I did not allow it to become anything visible. I processed it in the specific way of a person who has learned. Through 15 years of managing difficult business situations, to hold difficult truths without allowing them to distort the functioning that the situation requires. This was the discipline I had described to Helena when she arrived on the second day, and I told her I had been calm since the first morning. She had said, "You didn't panic." I said panicking would have been bad strategy. She said most people panic. I said I understood immediately that the situation was designed to produce panic. Producing what the situation was designed to produce is losing. She looked at me with the expression of someone who is assessing whether the person in front of them actually means what they are saying or is performing confidence. I meant it, not because I was naturally unafraid, but because I had understood, in the first hour of the first day, that what was being staged required my reaction to complete it, that the narrative of mental instability required me to behave in a way that was consistent with mental instability, and that choosing not to behave that way was the specific and available counter-move. The counter-move was available because the narrative was false. It would not have been available if the narrative were true. A person who is genuinely mentally unwell does not simply decide to appear well. And the specific quality of the calm I was maintaining across those 11 days was not a performance of calm, but the actual presence of a person whose mind was working clearly in difficult circumstances. Dr. Araujo had seen this. The 3 hours of his assessment had been the specific process of a skilled clinician, distinguishing between performed wellness and actual wellness. And he had found actual wellness because that was what was there. This is the thing that Antonio and Isabella had not fully calculated, that a strategy built on the false characterization of a person's mental state is vulnerable to the accurate characterization of that at mental state. The strategy works only if the characterization sticks. The characterization does not stick if the person it is applied to is, in fact, the strategy did not stick. I want to say something directly about Isabella, because I have described what she did without fully accounting for who she was. And the accounting is part of the honest account. Isabella is 40 years old now. She is, by all visible accounts, continuing her life in the specific way of the Salavea family, the apartment in Moema, the architecture work, the Sunday lunches in Higienopolis, the world that was always hers and that continues to be hers in the same form. She is Clara's mother, and she's in that role. A person I observe without fully knowing. What I observe is someone who is genuinely present with Clara, who is engaged and attentive, and who provides the specific stability that Isabella's formation is very good at providing. The structure, the routine, the quality of material environment that Clara's life in that household has. These are real contributions to a 6-year-old's development, and I do not diminish them. What I do not know is whether she made the decision about the Thursday morning on her own terms, or whether the decision was made for her, whether Antonio had designed the full architecture and Isabella had implemented it, or whether Isabella had been the active co-designer. The distinction matters for how I understand what the 8 years actually were, but it is a distinction I am not going to be able to resolve with the information available to me. What I can say is this: whether she decided, or whether she was told to, she participated. The Thursday morning was real, and she was part of it. And the part she played was the part of the person who asked me to come downstairs, because there were people who wanted to talk to me. She asked me in a specific way, not urgently, not dramatically, in the specific calm tone of a person who knows what the people downstairs are there for and who is managing herself through it. She knew. The knowing is what I hold, not with the ongoing heat of betrayal that heat dissipated across the proceedings and the months after, into the colder and more sustainable form of knowledge. She knew, and she participated, and the marriage was, in ways I'm still working out, something different from what I believed it to be for at least the last 2 years of its 8 was. Both things are true. The early years were real, and the late years were something else. I am learning to hold both without letting either one cancel the other. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Clara is drawing in the next room. She does this most evenings. When she is with me, she takes her notebooks and her pencils to the kitchen table, and she draws for an hour, sometimes longer, in the specific absorbed focus of a child who is fully inside the thing she is doing. The drawings are complex and detailed and slightly odd in the specific way of drawings by children who are working out something about the world rather than simply representing it. Figures in strange proportions. Buildings that are partly buildings and partly something else. Animals that are recognizable and also not quite right. I work at the same table, in the space beside her drawings. The work is the work I have always done, the operational assessments, the restructuring frameworks, the specific analytical work that 15 years of doing this has made a kind of second nature. I work, she draws. We are in the same room, and we are doing different things, and both things are what we are supposed to be doing. She will be here until Sunday. Then she goes to her mother's, and she will be there until Tuesday. And on Tuesday evening she will come back, and we will eat dinner, and she will draw. And I will work, and the week will proceed in the rhythm that the shared custody arrangement has given it. It is an imperfect arrangement. It is the arrangement that the 4 months produced, and the arrangement I worked for. And it is the best arrangement available in the circumstances, and I have made my peace with it being the best available rather than the best possible. The best possible was a different marriage that remained intact and that gave Clara the specific gift of 2 parents in the same household working together in her interest. That possibility was closed on the Thursday morning in April, and it was not closed by me. I accept the closing, because accepting it is the only honest relationship to it. And I do not wish the circumstances otherwise, because wishing circumstances otherwise is a way of refusing to live in the circumstances you are actually in. I am living in the circumstances I am actually in. They include a 6-year-old in the next room who is drawing something that I will be invited to assess in approximately 30 minutes. That is the whole of what matters. That is, in the end, enough.
Référendum de tutoring.
'I want to go back and describe the 4 months of the proceedings in more specific detail, because the 4 months are where the actual work happened, and the actual work deserves a fuller account than the summary I gave you. The first month was the month of the acute response. Helena's challenge to the court order, the court-appointed assessment, my release, the emergency access order for Clara, the first supervised visit. All of this happened in 4 weeks, and all of it required the specific quality of focused attention that acute situations require. The ability to identify what matters most, and to do that in while not losing track of the other things. What mattered most in the first month was the assessment. The court-appointed assessment was the document that would either confirm or refute the Isabella and Antonio narrative. And whether it confirmed or refuted that narrative depended entirely on whether Dr. Araujo was a careful and independent clinician, or whether he was susceptible to the same pressures that had produced Dr. Faria's evaluation. Helena had done her research on Dr. Araujo before he arrived for the assessment. She knew his professional history, his reputation among family court judges in Sao Paulo, the specific cases he had been assigned, and the specific quality of his assessments in those cases. She had concluded that he was genuinely independent, not because he was immune to pressure, but because his professional reputation was built on a body of work that reflected consistent independence. and a person whose professional reputation is built on consistent independence has made the specific decision to maintain that independence across every case. Because the alternative is a reputation built on its opposite. The 3 hours of the assessment confirmed her conclusion. Dr. Araujo was thorough, and he was independent, and he found what there was to find, which was a person who was functioning well under significantly adverse circumstances. The assessment was filed on the 7th day. My release was ordered on the 8th. I walked out of the clinic in Alphaville, carrying nothing but the clothes I had come in with, and the specific quality of settled clarity that the 11 days had produced. The second month was the month of the investigation. The investigation into Dr. Faria's background and his previous assessments was the work that would produce the pattern that the criminal complaint required. And the pattern required time the investigator needed to identify the cases, obtain the available public records, understand the connections, and build the documentation in a form that could be presented to a prosecutor. The investigator Helena used was a man named Rodrigo Santos, who had spent 12 years in the Sao Paulo Civil Police before leaving to build a private investigation practice that focused on exactly this kind of work. The specific intersection of professional misconduct and family law proceedings that required both investigative skill and knowledge of the legal context. He was methodical, and he was thorough, and he understood that the value of what he was producing was entirely dependent on its being documentable rather than merely credible. What he found, across 6 weeks of work, was documented in a 40-page report that Helena shared with me in parts as each section was completed. The first section was Dr. Faria's professional history, his training, his hospital affiliations, his practice profile, the organizations he belonged to, and the conferences he attended. This was the baseline context, the picture of a professionally credentialed psychiatrist with a legitimate clinical practice. Without the subsequent sections, this section would tell you nothing. With them, it tells you what the cover story looked like. The second section was the pattern of previous assessments. Rodrigo had identified 7 cases over the preceding 8 years in which Dr. Faria had produced psychiatric assessments in family law proceedings involving parties connected to the Salavea family network. In all 7 cases, the assessment had concluded in favor of the Salavea-connected party. In 5 of the 7, the assessment had been conducted without direct clinical contact with the assessed person, the same methodology that had produced my evaluation. The third section was the financial connections. This was the most difficult section to document, and the section with the least direct evidence, because the financial flows that would demonstrate the relationship between Dr. Faria's assessments and their financial benefit to him were routed through structures that were not immediately visible. What Rodrigo found was not direct evidence of payment, but the pattern of benefit Dr. Faria's practice had. In the years of his relationship with the Salavea network, expanded significantly, with new clients that were traceable to referral networks connected to Salavea family business associates. The pattern was not proof of corruption. It was evidence of a relationship that was difficult to explain innocently. Combined with the assessment methodology, no direct contact. Conclusions that consistently favored the commissioning party. The pattern was sufficient for the criminal complaint's purposes. Helena filed the complaint on the 31st day after my release. The third month was the month of the mediation and the parallel custody work. The mediation produced nothing directly, as I described, but the mediation session had a specific indirect consequence that Helena had anticipated and that I had not. The consequence was Isabella's lawyer. Isabella's primary lawyer was a man named Dr. Paulo Ramos, who was 60 years old and who had been practicing family law in Sao Paulo for 35 years, and who was, by Helena's assessment, competent and experienced, and not the kind of lawyer who would allow his client to pursue a strategy that he believed would produce a result worse than the alternative. The mediation gave Dr. Ramos a full view of what Helena had assembled. Not as a disclosure, the mediation was confidential, but in the specific way that a skilled lawyer reads another skilled lawyer's positioning, which is through the questions that are asked, and the areas where the willingness to press is evident, and the areas where it is not. Dr. Ramos, across the 3 hours of the mediation, had understood that Helena's position was significantly stronger than he had been led to believe by the evaluation process and the court order. After the mediation, the pace of the proceedings changed. The urgency that Isabella's side had been maintaining, the urgency of a party that believes it is winning and wants to move quickly before the circumstances change, became the more careful pacing of a party that has understood that moving quickly is no longer in its interest. This was the specific consequence of the criminal complaint, exactly as Helena had described it. Dr. Paulo Ramos had understood that the complaint against Dr. Faria created a secondary proceeding in which the methodology that had produced Isabella's primary strategic advantage was now the subject of criminal scrutiny, and that the best available outcome for his client was a settlement that did not require the original strategy to be defended in court. The settlement discussions began in the 4th month. They were conducted between Helena and Dr. Paulo Ramos, in the specific formal way of negotiations between lawyers in family law proceedings, without the drama of the direct confrontation that Isabella and I might have had if the lawyers had not managed the communication carefully. The settlement took 6 weeks to reach. 6 weeks of offers and counter-offers, and the patient specification of the terms that mattered most, and the terms that were negotiable, conducted in the specific language of family law that translates human stakes into legal categories with a compression that is sometimes useful and sometimes feels like a compression of something that deserves more space than the legal categories allow. What I wanted most was custody. Real custody. Joint legal custody with substantial physical time. What I was willing to trade was the financial settlement. Helena understood this and negotiated accordingly, consistently prioritizing the custody terms and yielding in the financial areas where yield was possible without compromising the business protections. The final terms reflected this prioritization. The custody terms were better than what the default in Sao Paulo family courts would have produced. The financial terms were not as favorable as they might have been if we had prioritized them. The business protections were intact. I accepted the terms on a Tuesday morning. In Helena's office, with a glass of water on the table in front of me, and the specific quality of a room that has been the site of significant things settling into ordinary space. Helena said, "You're satisfied with this." I said, "I'm satisfied that it's the best available outcome." "That's not the same as satisfied." She said, "No, it's not." I said, "It's sufficient." She said, "Yes." We signed the documents. The proceedings concluded. I walked out of her office on Avenida Paulista into the Sao Paulo midday, the light hard and bright and indifferent to the specific things that had just been resolved in the building behind me. And I called Marzio and said, "It's done." He said, "What do you need?" I said, "A coffee and a situation to work on." He said, "I have both." We met at a cafe near the office. He brought a file. We worked for 3 hours. The world continued. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I want to tell you about Clara one more time. In the specific way that the account of the preceding months demands not the 6-year-old who is drawing in the next room, but the 6-year-old who walked into the supervised access facility on the first Tuesday and said, "Papai, are you sick?" That question is the question I return to most often when I think about the full arc of what happened. Not because the question was painful, it was painful. But pain is not the reason I return to it. Because the question was a 6-year-old doing what 6-year-olds do, which is to ask the most direct version of the question they are trying to understand. And the question she was trying to understand was whether her father was someone she could rely on, or whether the version of him she had been given, the version her mother and grandparents had given her in 8 days of explanation, was the accurate one. I told her I was not sick. She said, "You're here now." The 2 sentences together are the most important exchange I had across those 4 months. The question and the answer, and then the quiet. Practical acknowledgement you're here now. Not an expression of relief. Not an emotional release. Not the dramatic reunion that the situation might have been. Simply, you're here now. The factual confirmation that the person she was with was present, which was the information she needed to continue. She continued. She continues. She is in the next room drawing, and I am here, which is the fact that everything that preceded this was in service of making possible. The diagnosis that was never real has no power over the present moment. The court order that was obtained improperly was challenged and overturned. The custody arrangement that was designed to marginalize me was replaced by the arrangement that gives me Tuesday and Thursday evenings and alternate weekends, and the shared presence in Clara's life that her growth requires. She is 8 years old. She will be 9 and 10 and 20. And I will be here for all of it, not every moment, not every day, but present in the specific and sustained way that matters. The person she can rely on to show up when he says he will. To tell her the truth when she asks for it. To be there in the way that a father is there for his child across the years of a childhood and beyond. This is the whole of what the 4 months were protecting. This specific and ordinary and completely irreplaceable presence. She is drawing something complicated. She will show it to me when she is ready. I will be here. When she is ready. That has always been, and remains, the complete account of what matters. I want to tell you about the specific texture of the Tuesday and Thursday evenings, because they are the anchors of the week, and because the account of what they are is the most direct account of what the 4 months produced. Tuesday evenings begin at 6. I collect Clara from school on the Tuesdays when I have her. I am the one who collects her, which was a specific and important element of the custody arrangement that Helena had pushed for because the collecting is its own form of presence, the arriving at the right time, and the being there when Shyam Saudha, and the walk to the car, or the walk home. The walk is the beginning of the evening. She tells me things on the walk that she does not tell me later. The urgent and immediately pressing concerns of a day at school. The things that have happened that needed a listener and that have been waiting for the moment I arrived. We eat dinner together. I cook, which is something I have been doing more in the years since the marriage ended, and which I am, by Clara's assessment, improving at but not yet good at. She is diplomatic about this. She has the Salavea precision of judgment combined with the specific loyalty of a child to the parent she is with, and the combination produces a quality of gentle criticism that is both useful and funny. After dinner, she draws. I work at the other end of the table. The drawing and the working happen in the same room for an hour, or sometimes 2. In the specific domestic quiet of 2 people doing their respective things in proximity. She sometimes shows me things as she is working not the finished drawing, but the in-progress drawing. The question of whether something is working or not working that she wants a second opinion on. I give the opinion. She considers it, and usually makes her own decision. At 8:30, she goes to bed. The going to bed process is the specific ritual that we developed in the first year of the custody arrangement, and that has settled into the form. It is now the brushing of teeth. The reading of whatever book she is currently reading aloud to me while I listen. The conversation about the next day. The lights out. I sit in the apartment after she is asleep for a while. Sometimes working, sometimes not. The quiet of the apartment when she is asleep in the next room is different from the quiet of the apartment when I am alone. It is inhabited quiet. The quiet of a space that contains a sleeping child and that carries. In that containment, the specific reassurance that she is here and that the being here was possible, and that the conditions that made it possible were won through the work of the 4 months. Thursday evenings are the same pattern. The collecting, the dinner, the drawing and working, the bedtime ritual. The second evening of the week has a slightly different quality from the first. She is less urgent, more settled. The things she tells me on the Thursday walk are the things that have had a day to develop, rather than the immediate concerns of the Tuesday. The drawing on Thursdays is sometimes the continuation of what she started on Tuesday, carried in her backpack between the 2 households. The carrying of the drawings between households is the clearest expression of what the shared custody arrangement is. She's the same person in both places, and the things she makes in one place are the things she continues in the other. The continuity is hers. The 2 households are the container of the continuity. I am one of the 2 containers. This is what I am. Not the only parent. Not the primary parent in any formal sense. But one of the 2. With equal legal standing and substantial physical time, and the specific quality of presence in her life that was the whole objective of the 4 months. The 4 months produced this. The Thursday morning produced the necessity of the 4 months. The necessity produced the work. The work produced the outcome. The outcome is the Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and the alternate weekends, and the drawing in the next room, and the opinion about whether the drawing is working, and the conversation on the walk, and the bedtime ritual, and the quiet of the inhabited apartment after she is asleep. I would do the 4 months again for this. I would do them again every time, without hesitation. As long as the outcome is this, she is drawing something. It is getting complicated. She will show me in 20 minutes, and she will want to know what I think, and I will tell her the truth. That is the end of the account. That is quite enough. I want to say one more thing about the marriage and what it was. Because I have described the ending of it in detail, and the beginning of it in outline, and the full account requires more of the middle. The 3rd year of the marriage was the year I was happiest. I say this precisely, not the 1st year, which was the year of discovery and adjustment, and the specific excitement of learning who a person actually is, and not the years after Clara arrived, which had a different and deeper quality of meaning that is not the same as happiness. The 3rd year was the year when we had established the shared life, and before the adjustment to parenthood had begun. And in that year, there was a quality to the daily texture of the marriage that I had not experienced before, and have not experienced since. What I want to preserve in the account is this. Isabella was, in that year, the most fully herself that I saw her in 8 years. The architecture work was going well. The partnership between us, the specific intellectual partnership of 2 people who engage with the world in different but complementary ways, was at its most productive. The evenings at the apartment had the quality of evenings that are genuinely shared 2 people in the same space, doing different things, and occasionally engaging across the difference in a way that makes both the doing and the engaging feel like the right way to spend an evening. I loved her in the 3rd year in the specific and clear way of a person who is with the person they want to be with, and who knows it. I want this to be part of the record because it is accurate, and because leaving it out would make the account of the marriage a simpler and less as honest account than the marriage deserves. The marriage was real. The ending of it was also real. Both things coexist in the record without canceling each other. The Thursday morning does not cancel the 3rd year. The 3rd year does not excuse the Thursday morning. I hold both. Most days. I hold both without significant difficulty. Some days are harder. This is the specific and ongoing work of the aftermath of a marriage that ended badly. Learning to hold what the marriage was, without letting the ending determine the assessment of the whole. The ending was wrong. The whole was not only the ending. Clara is the evidence. She is the evidence of the whole, of the years when the marriage was what it was supposed to be, and when the relationship between her parents was the relationship that produced her. She has both of her parents in her life, in the imperfect but genuine form that the shared custody arrangement provides, and the having of both is the direct product of the years when the marriage was real and the direct consequence of the 4 months when we fought for it to survive in the only form it could survive. She is drawing in this next room. In a few minutes, she will come to show me. I will be here when she comes. I will look at the drawing and tell her what I think, which will be the truth of what I think. That is what all of this was for. That is what matters. That is quite enough. I want to tell you about Helena Campos in more detail, because I have described what she did without fully describing who she is. And who she is makes what she did more comprehensible. Helena is 53 years old now. She grew up in Santo André, one of the cities of the greater São Paulo industrial belt, the daughter of a union organizer and a school administrator. She studied law at the PUC because the PUC was the university she could get to on the bus from Santo André, and because her grades were good enough to earn the scholarship that made it financially possible. She graduated in the top 5th of her class, and took the job that was offered a position at a mid-sized law firm in Santo Andre that handled family law and labor disputes. Not the prestigious Sao Paulo firms that the top graduates competed for, because the prestigious Sao Paulo firms were not recruiting in Santo Andre in that year, and she needed the income immediately. She spent 7 years at the firm in Santo Andre, learning the specific practice of family law from the inside the cases, the clients, the judges, the social workers, the specific human texture of a domain that deals with people at the moments of their greatest vulnerability and their greatest conflict. The family law cases in Santo Andre in the mid-2000s were not the wealthy Sao Paulo cases that she would eventually specialize in. They were the cases of ordinary people with ordinary assets and extraordinary levels of pain. The cases where the outcome mattered enormously and the resources to pursue it were limited. She learned, in those 7 years, to be efficient, to do the most with the least, to identify what actually mattered in a case and to build toward that rather than toward the full scope of what might theoretically be possible. This is the specific discipline of a lawyer who has always operated with constrained resources, and it is the discipline that makes her good in the kind of case I was in, because the kind of case I was in, however significant the resources involved, required exactly this quality of focused efficiency rather than the comprehensive maximalism that some wealthy client cases produce. She moved to Sao Paulo in her 30s, to a firm that handled more complex family law matters, and spent 8 years there before establishing her own practice. The practice she built was the one that Helena's reputation had made possible, the specific reputation for working the cases that sit at the intersection of family law and criminal law, the cases where someone has done something that should not have been done, and where the doing of it needed to be both challenged legally and addressed substantively. She had done this 20 times before she did it for me. Each of the 20 had taught her something, and the accumulated teaching was what she brought to the Thursday morning and the 4 months that followed it. I told her, after the proceedings concluded, that she was the right lawyer for the situation. She said I was the right lawyer because I understood immediately what the situation was. Not all lawyers would have seen it that way. I said, what did they do wrong, the lawyers who didn't see it that way? She said they would have treated it as a mental health case and tried to win on the clinical merits. The clinical merits were clear. You're not mentally ill. But winning on the clinical merits alone would have taken longer and would not have addressed the mechanism. The mechanism was what needed to be addressed, because the mechanism was the thing that could be repeated. I said you went for the mechanism. She said I went for the mechanism and the record and the custody simultaneously, because those 3 things together were what the situation required. The mechanism to stop it from happening again. The record to ensure it was documented as what it was. The custody to secure what was actually at stake. I said, how did you see all 3 so quickly? She said, because I've seen it before. Not often this specific form, where the psychiatric commitment is the mechanism, is not common. But the underlying structure, a wealthy family using an institutional mechanism to gain advantage in a family law proceeding that I've seen before. She paused. She said, and because you walked into the 2nd day session and told me about the first morning's decision, the decision not to panic, that told me what I needed to know about the kind of case this was going to be. I said, what did it tell you? She said it told me the person I was working for was someone who understood that the situation required a specific quality of controlled functioning, and who had the capacity to provide it, which meant the strategy could be built on that foundation. If you had panicked in the first day, the strategy would have had to account for the panic. The absence of panic meant the strategy could be cleaner. I thought about this. I said the first morning in the room, the decision not to panic, was it actually strategic? Or was it just what I had to do to get through the morning? She said, "Does the distinction matter?" I said, "I think it does." If it was strategic, I'm claiming credit for a calculated decision. If it was just what I had to do to survive the morning, the credit is different. She said, "I think it was both. A decision that was strategic, and that was also the only way to get through the morning. Those aren't mutually exclusive." I said, "No, they're not." We were in the cafe near her office where we had met in the first week. The cafe that had become the location for our end of proceedings meeting, in the way that the significant conversations in a professional relationship tend to happen in the location of their beginning. The waiter brought 2 glasses of water. The afternoon traffic outside was the afternoon traffic that Sao Paulo always has constant, and somehow also varied. The specific texture of a city that is always in motion. She said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "Go back to work." She said, "And beyond that?" I said, "Build toward the next stage." The businesses are at a point where the next stage needs to be defined. Marcio and I have been talking about what that looks like, she said, and personally, I said, "Be Clara's father. That's the personal project for the next decade, and it's sufficient." She said, "You're not going to look for." I said, "Not now. Not for a while. The priority is the right priority, and I know what it is." She nodded. She understood this in the way that a person who has spent 15 years in family law understands the specific form of the priority that is established by the survival of a custody proceeding and the understanding that the thing you fought for is the thing that now organizes everything else, and that the organizing is not a burden, but a gift. The gift is the Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The gift is the alternate weekends. The gift is the drawing in the next room, and the question of whether it is working, and the truth of what I think. I went back to work. I'm still working. The drawing is being worked on in the next room. This is the complete account. I want to say one final thing about the Thursday morning and why it continues to matter to me, even though it is now 2 years past, and the proceedings have concluded, and the daily life has settled into the rhythm that shared custody produces. It matters because it was the specific test of whether the person I believed myself to be was actually the person I was. Not the test of whether I was mentally healthy. That was never a genuine question. The answer was always clear. Dr. Araujo found what was there because what was there was not what the evaluation had claimed. The test of something more specific, whether I was the person who, in the first morning of an extreme and manufactured crisis, could identify what the crisis required and provide it without losing the thread of what the crisis was actually about. The crisis was about Clara. From the first hour of the first morning, the crisis was about Clara, about whether I was going to be the person who was present in her life, in the specific and sustained way that a father is present in a child's life, when the custody arrangement gives him genuine time and genuine standing. The commitment form. The clinic. The 4 months of proceedings, all of this was the mechanism for determining whether I was going to be that person. I was that person. The determination confirmed it. This is not a triumphant statement. Triumph is not the right word for the end of a process that involved 11 days in a psychiatric clinic and a criminal complaint and a custody fight over a 6-year-old child. The right word is something closer to relief, the specific relief of a person who has been tested at the limit of their resilience and who has found that the resilience held. The resilience held because it was real. Clara will ask me someday. Not now. She is 8, and the questions she asks are 8-year-old questions, but someday she will ask about the period when she was 6 and her father was away, and things were difficult, and she was told things about her father that were not true. She will ask, and I will tell her the truth. In the careful and age-appropriate form that truth takes when it is being told to an adult child about a painful period of their childhood. I will tell her that her mother and her grandfather made a mistake, that the mistake was serious, and that it had consequences that were addressed through the legal process, that the addressing of it produced the arrangement she has grown up in, and that the arrangement she has grown up in has given her 2 parents who are both present in her life, in the imperfect but genuine form that the circumstances allowed. I will tell her that I chose to fight for the arrangement because she was worth fighting for. She will know this before I tell her, because she has been living in the evidence of it her whole life. The Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the drawing at the kitchen table, the truth of what I think when she asks. This is what was fought for. This is what was won. This is what continues. That is the end of the account, and it is the right end. And it is, in every way that matters. Enough. There are 3 things I want to add to the account before I close it. Because 3 things have been present throughout the account without being named directly. And naming them directly is the most honest way to end. The first is the specific quality of Sao Paulo as the context for a situation like this one. I said something about this earlier about the networks, about the way the city's establishment operates, but I want to say it more directly. Sao Paulo is a city where power is real, and where the consequences of being outside the circle of power are real, and where the specific mechanisms that Antonio used to try to take what he wanted are mechanisms that exist and are used. The Thursday morning was not an aberration. It was a use of tools that exist in this city's specific environment. The tools can be countered. I countered them, but they exist, and the existence is part of the honest account. The second is the specific debt I owe to Helena Campos, which is not fully expressible in the account I have given, because it is not fully expressible in any account. She took a case that required 15 years of specific expertise, and she applied that expertise with a quality of focused attention that determined the outcome. The outcome was Clara's custody in the form it took. The debt is proportional to that. The third is Clara herself, who is not owed a debt, but who is owed an account, the full account, given when she is old enough to receive it, of what was done and what was done in response and what the response produced. She will receive that account from me when the time is right, in the honest and careful way that she deserves. She is 8 years old. The time is not yet right. It will come. I will be here when it comes. I am here now. That is the complete account. That is the last line of it. She is coming to show me the drawing. I can hear her in the next room. The sound of the pencils being put down. the scrape of the chair. She is coming to the kitchen with the notebook in her hand, and she will show it to me, and she will ask what I think, and I will look at it carefully, and I will tell her the truth of what I think, which is the most important thing I can give her, and the most important thing any parent can give their child. Not the version that is easy to hear, but the version that is accurate. Because accurate is what she will need to navigate the world she is going to inherit. She is coming. She is here. I am looking at the drawing. It is complicated and strange and a little bit wonderful, which is what the best drawings of children who are working out the world always are. I tell her what I think. She considers it. She goes back to the table. The evening continues. This is what the 4 months were for. This is what the account is of. This is the end.